The early 1900s in Dublin was a very interesting phase for women's participation in activism and revolutionary politics in the development of the suffrage movement. And quite a number of women were very much involved. A lot of them lived around the Rathmines, Rathgar area. In fact, one of the roads in Rathmines, Belgrave Road, was known as Revolutionary Road because so many of the women were living there. But one of the women I'm really interested in is Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who, as well as being a suffrage campaigner and socialist, was also a medical doctor, which was very unusual for a woman in the early 20th century. Kathleen was born in County Mayo, where her father was a Church of Ireland clergyman. She was educated in Alexandra College here in Dublin and went on to study in the Catholic University Medical School. And she, among many women, was a socialist, a nationalist, a feminist, fighting for women's rights, for the rights of the Irish nation, and for the rights of people caught below the poverty line, for the workers of Dublin. Lynn herself, I suppose, became most publicly active first during the 1913 lockout, when the workers of Dublin were locked out by their employers, which led to huge hardship on the streets of Dublin, and she and many of the other women, particularly the women in the Irish Women's Workers' Union, including one of her close friends and comrades in arms, Helena Maloney, set up a soup kitchen for the starving children particularly, but the starving workers of Dublin during the 1913 lockout. And that really politicised an awful lot of the women then, to see that the forces of the state and the forces of the employers could be brought to bear on the poorest and most vulnerable in society. So they work among the poor, and it is at this time that she joins the Irish Citizen Army. Now, the Irish Citizen Army is a very interesting, it's a workers' militia that's set up to defend the workers against particularly attacks by the Dublin Metropolitan Police, who are used by the employers to break up strikes. The Irish Citizen Army also allows women and men to join on equal terms. So Kathleen Lynn was actually the chief medical officer in the Irish Citizen Army. She was officer status, which is unusual. Between 1913 and 1916, when the Rising begins, Kathleen Lynn continues her activism in the Irish Citizen Army, but she also teaches the Cumann na mBan women first aid training. And so in the lead up to the revolution, or the Rising in 1916, she's very much involved in a lot of planning and a lot of getting the people who will participate in the Rising ready. When the revolution starts itself, she is part of the City Hall battalion. She goes there with Commandant Sean Connolly, who's shot in the first hours, which means Lynn takes over in City Hall. So Lynn and Madeleine French-Mullen and many of the women of the Irish Citizen Army were not only there during 1916, but they were active participants, something that people have denied a lot of women's participation in the Rising and in revolutionary politics in Ireland in particular. And I think it's very important that women's participation and women's activism should be celebrated. Lynn and French-Mullen and Helena Maloney and Markovich and many of the other women who come out in 1916 are imprisoned then after the surrender in Kilmainham jail, where Kathleen Lynn, as a doctor, realises that the treatment they were getting there and the food they were getting there was detrimental to the health of the women, and makes huge protest about this. So not only is she always an activist in terms of socialism and equality and feminism, she's also very concerned about health matters, and this has real meaning for the rest of her career. In 1919, she and Madeleine French-Mullen set up the St. Ultan's Hospital for Infants. It is a very necessary hospital because there is no real treatment for young children and infants, particularly the young children and infants of the poor of Dublin. And the tenements in Dublin are among the worst in the world. Many of the reports that have been done in the early 1900s see them as the poorest of the poor of all European cities. Many of the poor of Dublin are living in one room in these Georgian houses that have been left fall into ruin. They have no running water, they have no proper sewage systems because of the dirt and the lack of hygiene. Things like smallpox and TB and typhus and cholera run rampant through the tenements of Dublin. And it is among these people, particularly the children who live in the tenements, that Kathleen Lynn sees her career as a medical practitioner. And in setting up St. Ultan's Hospital for Infants and Children, she is providing this sort of help to the poor of Dublin. She's an amazing woman. She continues all of her life in her belief in equality. She runs for office as a TD in 1923 and is elected as a Sinn Féin TD. But of obviously being anti-treaty, she doesn't take her seat because she didn't believe that the Irish Free State, which was set up, was what she had fought for in 1916. And because of that, has no real influence at the centre of political activism from the time of the foundation of the Irish Free State, despite being elected, because she doesn't take her seat, and she isn't re-elected then in the election of 1927. So her participation in the Irish Free State is about the politics of care, I suppose. And she's very much involved in that, in the setting up of St. Ultan's. She was responsible for the introduction of the BCG inoculation. She was responsible for the beginning of the campaign to eradicate TB, a blight on all of Ireland, and is not eventually eradicated until much later in the century. But she is one of the first doctors who sees how it is necessary and how it can be done to eradicate TB from Ireland. She also is very interested in education and sees education as a way forward out of poverty, and brings Maria Montessori, the famous Italian educationalist, to Dublin in the 1930s, and is the first to see the benefits of that sort of teaching among children who need better education. She was also very interested in things like outdoors, fresh air, exercise, and was very much a supporter of An Oige, and indeed after her death donated her holiday home in the Wicklow Hills to An Oige, which they still use as one of their hospitals. She was a great believer in fresh air, getting out there, bringing the fresh air into your lungs, and of course that really helped an awful lot of the young children who were growing up in a polluted atmosphere in inner city Dublin. They had no access to fresh air and good food, and Kathleen Lynn campaigned for that. Her participation as a woman has been somewhat recognised. There are some really good biographies written of her. Most recently, Margaret O'Hogarty wrote a biography of Kathleen Lynn, and her participation is beginning to be recognised. But the fact that she set up one of the first hospitals, she was one of the first women medical doctors, she was a woman, a revolutionary who was out in 1916, a socialist who believed in helping the poor and the most vulnerable, and a feminist who believed in the equal participation of women and the votes for women. She was also part of the Irish Women's Workers' Union. She was elected as a TD for Sinn Féin. She was truly committed to her politics, nationalist, feminist, socialist, or as a medical doctor. And she is somebody who deservedly needs to be celebrated.